Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here and I'm really happy to talk about this topic today. It's another really interesting take on some of the historical things that have gone on for Italian Americans, also from sort of a linguistical perspective. So I'm really happy to share this topic with you. I've watched a lot of videos about this topic and I've also read a lot of literature about it, so I've covered a lot, but I will say that there's one video in particular that really sticks out to me, and I'll probably even link it in the bio so that you guys can check it out. NYTN did a great video about sort of the social stigma involved with being an enemy alien at the time during World War II, and that this was one of the many reasons why Italian Americans stopped speaking Italian altogether, mainly because there was a social stigma attached with being Italian and because they wanted to be recognized as Americans, right? So because English was considered the official language of the United States, they stopped speaking Italian and therefore only spoke in English. The host of that video does a great job talking about this topic, and she's very thorough in her research, so I really appreciate all of the labor that she's done there. What she says is absolutely true, but I want to give a linguistical twist to this story because there is a little bit more involved here and something that I think is actually really relevant to most of your ancestors. So it is true, during the years of World War II, Italians, along with the Japanese and Germans, were considered alien enemies, and that meant that they were prohibited from speaking their language, and it was very stigmatized for them to speak their native language. I mean, they were heavily discriminated against. In many cases, they were interned. A lot of people don't realize that Italians and German Americans were also interned, not just the Japanese, although the Japanese were interned in much higher numbers. So I don't want to minimize what that community went through. But it is estimated that about 1,600 Italians were interned at the time, in addition to the surveillance that Italian Americans went through by the American government. This included curfews and all kinds of crazy stuff. A lot of them lost their jobs. I mean, it really impacted the Italian community heavily, both in terms of economics and just like social stigma and all of that, okay? So this is definitely a reason why a lot of people stopped speaking in Italian and only spoke in English. In many cases, they felt very betrayed by their new country, and they really wanted to be considered Americans, right? They wanted to be embraced by their new country. And they felt like language was a big piece of that. So as I said, that is a part of it, and it's a really important part of the puzzle. However, there's an even, I don't know if it's a bigger piece, but it's a substantial piece of the puzzle that I think gets lost a lot, because unless you speak Italian and unless you visited Italy as a country, you might not recognize how significant this would have been at the time. So for a lot of you, if your family members immigrated during that post-unification period, so after 1861 and into the early 1900s, then it's more than likely your family members didn't even speak Italian, okay? A lot of them came from the South, and in the South there were a lot of dialects. As a matter of fact, there were hundreds of dialects in Italy prior to unification, and a lot of those dialects still persist today. At the time of Italian unification, it's estimated that only 2 to 10% of the Italian population even spoke standard Italian. Italian was actually what I'm calling a standard Italian, was actually just a regional dialect from Florence, okay? So it wasn't even considered the official language until much later. We're talking post-World War II. A lot of people don't understand what I just said about Italian. The standard Italian language that we know today was actually considered a dialect for a region at that time. And so this is really important to understand, because this was a language that was primarily spoken and understood by the elite class. Specifically, if your family came from the South, and most of yours probably did, because about 80% of the people that immigrated from Italy to the Americas were coming from a southern region. Those people definitely spoke in dialect. The majority of them couldn't even read or write. A lot of them were illiterate. So since the Italian language wasn't declared the official language of the country until around the time the Constitution was written, so this would have been like 1948, if you do the math and your family came before that period, it's more than likely that your family primarily spoke a dialect. Maybe they understood Italian, but they probably didn't use it in their households. And so that meant that they weren't going to pass it on to you. So I remember when I first happened upon this topic altogether, and it was because some of my family members mentioned that some of our other family members that had immigrated from Italy spoke Italian funny. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if they spoke Italian at all. And just because I knew that the dialect was something that was heavily used there, and I was like, I wonder at what time they even started to speak Italian. So I started to really dig, and I found all this information. It's really fascinating history. Now let's go back into history a little bit. Of course, you knew I was going to bring up the influence of Italian fascism because this is a major issue that affected the languages that we see in Italy today. As I stated before, there were hundreds of dialects that were spoken and used at the time of Italian unification, and they continued to be used long after. In many cases, they're still used today. When I went to Calabria years ago, I got some family documents, including some birth records that even had Calabrian language from that village written on the document. So it's interesting that this was something that was even used at the local governmental level. Communication was quite difficult between regions because people spoke vastly different languages, and those languages and dialects are not very intelligible between people if they don't speak them, right? So communication was very difficult. It was difficult to sort of transmit information, certainly propaganda, and so on. Mussolini, when he was in power, he really wanted to unite people under this idea of Italian nationalism, Italian identity, and he felt like one of the ways to do that was to regulate language. This is interesting when we talk about totalitarian regimes because language is often attacked. It's very fascinating to observe this throughout history, but Italy is certainly no exception. As a result, the Italian dialects and languages that were spoken regionally were largely restricted at very least, if not banned altogether. And there are some really interesting linguistical tendencies that happen between even the north and south of Italy within what we call standard Italian today. I'm not going to get into that in this video. I'll do that in a different video some other time. But it's fascinating to see the ways that Italian fascism affected the language and has continued to affect the language even until today, decades later. At the time of unification, education was not widely acceptable to the vast majority of people because, again, remember, these people, at least the majority, were considered peasants. They were working class folks. They didn't have access to the education system that we see throughout Italy today. Now, that meant that Italian and Latin and some of these other more classical languages were spoken and learned by the elite class only. It wasn't until after unification, when people had more access to education and literacy rates started to rise, that the Italian language really took a stronghold. There were some dialects that were specifically targeted, mainly in the deep south and also in the far north. There was a lot of propaganda to promote the idea that speaking a dialect was low class or anti-intellectual or ignorant and these sorts of ideas. And what's sad and really kind of interesting in a way, but mostly sad, these ideas still persist today. This is something that I hear a lot, actually, even by people that speak regional dialects. Some of them still sort of carry this internalized idea that the dialects are low class. And that is really sad to me. And if we don't sort of get rid of this idea, then I fear that some of these local languages will eventually die out. Schools at that time were supposed to strictly teach Italian, and as a matter of fact, using dialect within the schools was banned, and students were even punished for speaking dialect at school. All publications, broadcasts, media, and so on were distributed in Italian, and it was heavily restricted to use dialect in that kind of distribution. So, going back to the topic at hand, unless your family immigrated to the U.S. post this period, which is kind of unlikely. I mean, it happens, right? There are some people that came after that period, but the vast majority of people of Italian ancestry that reside in the United States, at least, their family members came prior to World War II, okay? So that means that they probably didn't speak Italian. They probably spoke local dialects. Now, it is sort of normal that language gets lost along the way. If a person moves from their home country and they settle in a new one, they have children, and unless that child is taught their native language at school, it's more than likely that that language is going to get lost. So we have a couple different factors going on here, right? We have the historical reasons, the linguistical reasons, and then just the nature of adapting and becoming a citizen of the new country that you're part of. There are a lot of Italian American people, primarily on the East Coast, that still speak Italian or sort of like a Creole Italian English. Also, what's interesting about this is a lot of the people that do speak this sort of hybrid language, they weren't really speaking Italian in the first place. Again, going back to my original point, a lot of them, their families came from places where they spoke dialect, right? So the Italian language that we hear these people speak today, and some of the words like food-related words that they pronounce kind of funny, it's not Italian, okay? It is sort of a different language. And I mean, from a linguistical standpoint, I can see this as just sort of the natural adaptation of language, right? From a sort of purist Italian perspective, I can understand why this might be a little bit frustrating to Italians, but I mean, this is kind of the nature of how language works and evolves. And I mean, even within Italy, we're seeing a lot of English used. This is totally typical within the linguistical realm. I mean, this happens all the time. But I can see how for some people that are sort of motherland Italians or Italian purists, this is really irritating. And in some cases, they're like, well, they're not actually speaking Italian. It's like, okay, you're right. They aren't actually speaking Italian. They're speaking sort of a new hybrid language of what is or what was the dialect at that time and English. Now, if you grew up in a family that managed to preserve the language at all, you're quite lucky, because a lot of Italian American people, whether that's first, second, third, fourth, and so on generations, they might not have heard Italian in their homes at all. So despite there being a lot of linguistical variation between the North and the South, all the dialects, local languages, and so on, this is really interesting history, and it's something that I think a lot of people don't know, they don't understand, so I'm really happy to share it. I'm so happy to be able to talk about these topics, and if you have any other topics that are related or something you would like to know regarding Italian language, linguistical history, Italian American immigration history, all of those sorts of things, I would be more than happy to touch on it in other videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please comment, like, share, subscribe, all the things. I really appreciate it, and it helps out the channel a lot. I will see you in the next video. Bye.